This killer's story begins in 1987. David Heiss was born on June the 19th to a Bolivian mother and a German father in Frankfurt, West Germany. He was the eldest of 2 children.
Affluent, he had quite a leafy suburban upbringing, but he was unhappy.
Heiss's childhood is quite a turbulent one. So his parents separated when he was 6, and his mother went on to remarry.
After his parents divorced, it was decided that Heiss would live with his grandparents near Limburg an der Lahn.
And he was effectively brought up by his grandmother and grandfather, to whom he was close.
I think he feels like he's the outcast. And when you have those interruptions, those disruptions in the attachment that somebody has with their parents, their primary caregivers, that starts to have an impact on the relationships that they have with other people.
Heiss's mother remarried and went on to have more children.
I think here we've got an individual who feels like he never really sort of fits in. His mother's formed a new family unit, so I think there's always that feeling of being an outsider, of being awkward, of not having a sense of belonging in the family.
His mother, a nurse, still lived in the town, but he barely spoke to her, and his father was even more distant from him.
As a result, Heiss became insular and isolated.
Heiss is put out to pastures. And the message in there to the child is very simple. Love can't be counted. The closest thing to you can just set you aside and go on to a new life as if it's nothing. This creates a desperate sense of insecurity.
I think very early on in those early years, we're starting to see the seeds sown for a disruptive adulthood, for somebody who's going to have difficulties with relationships, but it becomes an awful lot worse than that.
Estranged from his parents, Heiss also struggled to make friends.
He was an isolated child. He took refuge, as so many adolescents do now, in the net, in his bedroom, his computer.
The teen would spend up to 8 hours a day on the internet and developed a passion for online gaming. His social interaction was limited to other gamers.
Here's somebody who doesn't have great relationships with his peers, so he seeks solace online. He makes friendships with people in the virtual world, and the virtual world is very different from the real one because you've got a lack of social cues. You've got that lack of kind of eye contact, of seeing a person face to face. And I think this is something that actually suited him down to the ground.
At school, Heiss excelled academically, but he couldn't afford to go to university.
It was a fact that rankled him. I think he felt from a very early age, that's what I was due. I want to be at a university. He was clearly clever enough, but it wasn't possible.
Aged 19, he decided to join the military, but after just 2 weeks he was discharged for not being mentally suitable. Instead, Heiss took up an apprenticeship at a textile dye production company.
And in itself, that, coupled with his extraordinarily isolated childhood, turned him into an introverted, unhappy, complicated boy who had never come to terms with any kind of relationship.
And things would only get worse for the troubled teen when his grandfather died in 2007. At approximately 1 a.m., David Heiss made his way to Joanna and Matthew's flat.
We've got images of him putting his bag down, walking up the road, hiding his bag, coming back, spending a lot of time just thinking what he was going to do.
He doesn't knock on the door. He sleeps outside the flat, beside an air conditioning unit, which was presumably giving out some heat. It's not the depths of winter, but it still was cold.
Joanna and Matthew had no idea that Heiss was back in the country and just meters away from them.
When Joanna got up in the morning in order to go to work, she kissed Matthew goodbye and she walked out.
And he specifically waits for Joanna to go out to work in the morning. He watches her leave. He's now decided that the only way he can have her is if he kills her boyfriend, Matthew.
With Joanna now out of sight, Heiss made his way up to their flat.
He's got gardening gloves with him. He's got a weapon with him. This is premeditated. This is planned. This is something that he intends to do. It is very execution-like in style.
Heiss then knocked on the door.
The moment that Matthew opens the door, David Heiss launches himself at him, stabbing him repeatedly. And indeed, stabbing him relentlessly with the knife that he's brought specifically for the purpose.
In a cruel and frenzied attack, Heiss chased Matthew around the small flat.
Matthew had gone into the fetal position behind the closed door and then managed to escape and go running down the corridor and into the lounge. You could see evidence of where he had banged into items such as doors or cupboards and where the blood was smeared. And then he was pursued across into the corner of his bedroom come lounge.
David Heiss had viciously stabbed Matthew a total of 86 times.
So this is something that is way more than you need to do to end a person's life. He didn't just want to kill Matthew, he wanted to completely obliterate him and have complete control. He was very incensed that this barrier was in the way to getting the thing that he wanted, which was the relationship with Joanna. So killing him wasn't enough.
To stab somebody 86 times actually takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort. It tells you that somebody really, really means to cause that person very serious harm. We would normally describe this sort of murder as a sustained assault. This is not a moment of madness. This is planned, it's calculated.
It's just an explosion of cathartic rage. He has been between him and his true love from the day that they met.
Despite his horrific injuries, Matthew managed to leave a clue to his killer at the scene of the crime.
To Matthew's eternal credit, he managed, in his last moments, to write the first 3 letters of David Heiss's name in his own blood on his computer console. He wrote D-A-V, presumably hoping that someone would recognize what that meant and lead the police to David Heiss.
In one sense, the fact that he was still conscious enough, still willing enough to try and identify his assailant, to write the first 3 letters of his name on a monitor shows how strong he was, but at the same time, it tells us that he was conscious, he knew what he was doing throughout the whole of that attack.
Tragically, Matthew died from his horrific injuries. Heiss had thought he'd committed the perfect murder, but he was now the police's main suspect. They just needed to find him. The police were now looking into the killer's background.
Well, we started to make some investigations around Heiss and where he was from. The only thing that we'd got from some of the gamers was that he maybe lived near Frankfurt, and we didn't have any other information.
After talking to other gamers, the police discovered that Heiss was apparently online the morning that Matthew was murdered.
We had managed to convince his sister that he was going away overnight to a party and that he needed somebody to manage his online account, and then got his sister to log on to the computer. We were really concerned about that. Had we got this right?
Even though he'd killed Matthew, Heiss continued to act innocent to the other gamers.
When he was back in Germany, he began to say, "How is Matthew? And has anybody heard from Matthew?" Well, Matthew was dead.
However, the police were still convinced that Heiss was their main suspect. But since he was an online gamer, they had no idea where to find him. Then there was a breakthrough in the case. Information came through about the car crash that Heiss was involved in back in August.
The fact that the police had attended that crash, and what had happened was that some items had been sent to Heiss from the car by the AAA. It's like the European version of the recovery service in the UK. And that gave us a couple of addresses that linked to Heiss. So we were then able to go to the courts in the UK. We give them enough information that suggests we should arrest this individual.
With a European arrest warrant, the police went through Europol and made contact with the German authorities. Ufa Quimbach and Rashid Barouch were assigned to the case.
After receiving a formal request, we carried out the background checks. The only thing we knew was that he was a young man that lived in the district of Limburg-Walburg. He didn't show up in any police records, so we found nothing. It was a total blank slate for us.
Heiss, unaware that he was being investigated, decided to send Joanna a message on Facebook 4 days after he'd murdered her boyfriend.
He wrote a note which said, "I'm sorry for causing you so much trouble. I hope you won't lose all your hope. We will be there for you." That gives you an indication of the distortion of Heiss's mind. We will be there for you? No, I think what he really meant was, I will be there for you. What he really hoped is that Joanna would fall into his arms, that she'd somehow be won over by the fact that he'd eliminated her boyfriend.
This is a very clumsy attempt at trying to worm his way back into her affections. And this really does, again, show his complete lack of judgment, his complete lack of awareness of social norms, of ways to behave when somebody has died.
It reflects a complete inability to see the world from the perspective of the victim.
Meanwhile, the German authorities now had an address for Heiss, and on the 24th of September, he was finally arrested. Tracie Andrews was born on the 9th of April 1969 in the West Midlands.
Well, Tracie was brought up just outside Birmingham in Redditch and Alvechurch, and she was the middle child. She had an older sibling and a younger sibling and several half-siblings. And her parents broke up when she was around about 6 years old because they'd had quite a volatile relationship.
The separation of her parents in 1975 had a lasting effect on young Tracie.
Well, Tracie's parents split up and her mother got married to another man. And when we look at our parents' relationships, they are quite important because they inform our expectations of other people, our expectations of the relationships that we go on to have.
Kids need attention, you know, they need to be loved and cuddled and everything. And a lot of kids that come from those kind of broken homes, and the case of Tracie, they want to be loved by mother, father, or somebody. So that is definitely, in my opinion, one of the things that pushed her into always wanting the attention of other men.
Tracie left school in 1986, and aged 21, she had a baby daughter. But the relationship with her partner lasted barely a year, and they soon went their separate ways.
What we've got here is a woman who doesn't like her partners having a life that doesn't involve her. She doesn't like her partners going out without her. She gets very jealous, she's very possessive.
She certainly had a temper. Everybody who knew her said she had a temper, and when she lost her temper, everybody knew about it. She would shout at the top of her voice. The whole street would hear.
By 1994, 25-year-old Tracie was living in a council flat in Alvechurch and working as a barmaid. But her aspirations went far beyond pulling pints.
She had visions, she had dreams of becoming a model, but and you know, she was very photogenic. She looked good on camera, and she knew it, and she had some pictures taken and a photo album put together, but that never really took off either.
She became a barmaid, working in a pub, but she still dressed very provocatively, and she still loved talking to men and chatting to men. Again, seeking the attention that she wanted to get as a model, because obviously when you're that pretty and you're a model, you do get a lot of attention.
Living nearby to Tracie was 23-year-old Lee Harvey. He also had a daughter from a previous relationship.
Lee Harvey was a young man from a very close family, and he worked as a bus driver for the West Midlands Travel. So this was a job that involved meeting many people on a daily basis. He was very outgoing. He was interested in cars and was always very well turned out. So he was your typical young Birmingham lad, essentially, very close to his mum, very close to his sister.
The paths of the two young single parents would soon cross.
Well, Lee and Tracie met in October 1994 in Ritzy's nightclub in Birmingham, and this relationship really did develop at a lightning pace. They had moved in with one another only around 3 months into the relationship, so this was going very, very fast. And their relationship was quite a volatile one. They were both quite possessive, quite jealous when it came to the other's relationships with the opposite sex. And you often find this in relationships that develop very quickly. You haven't got that foundation of trust that's been built. You're always a little bit kind of suspicious as to what the other person's up to because you don't really know them.
And they would row and they would fight like cat and dog. And neighbours would report how voices would be raised at all hours of the day and night and would go on and on for hours and then stop and then start again.
The couple got engaged after just 6 months, but their volatile relationship would often see them break up, only to get back together again soon after.
It was maybe almost a carbon copy of what Tracie grew up with in her house. She had a very explosive temper, and Lee Harvey also, in a way, wouldn't like just bow down to her screaming, so he would scream back.
She was forever throwing him out into the street, and she would throw his clothes out of the window or in a black bin bag and chuck him out the front door, change the locks. And then they would have reconciliations. Lee would go back, more violence, Lee would leave, Lee would go back, more violence. This went on for a period of about 2 years.
Their explosive relationship finally came to a head on December the 1st, 1996.
So they'd been rowing all day. Lee tended to be the peacemaker, and it was probably Lee's suggestion, why don't we go for a drink? Why don't we just get a change of scene, a breath of fresh air? Let's get out of here, let's just go and relax and have a drink. And that's what they did.
But Lee Harvey would never make it home again. By 11 p.m, he would be dead. The only witness to the fatal altercation was his fiancée, Tracie Andrews, and her version of events would soon make it one of the most talked about murders of the decade. On December the 3rd, 1996, 27-year-old Tracie Andrews appeared at an emotionally charged press conference in an appeal to find the passenger of a Ford Sierra who she claimed had stabbed her fiancé Lee Harvey to death. But unbeknownst to Andrews, the police were beginning to work out the truth, that she had been the one responsible for the murder of 25-year-old Lee.
It's self-preservation. That's what's driving her behaviour at this point in time. She's got absolutely no empathy whatsoever for Lee or for Lee's family, or indeed for her own family, who are also going to be really badly affected by this. So she's thinking, how do I best preserve myself? I'm going to take that role of the victim and I'm going to put myself in it.
Andrews' claim that she and Lee had been the victim of a road rage incident didn't seem to add up. A witness statement from a child staying in a house on Cooper's Hill put her version of events in doubt.
It was December, the windows were closed, but she could clearly hear a row going on. What she remembered was that one was a distinctly male baritone voice. The other voice was much softer. And she said it was much more like a woman's voice.
Forensic searches of the road had discovered more clues into what really happened.
We couldn't get anywhere near the scene on the first morning, or indeed for a few days afterwards. The police completely sealed it off while they drafted in officers to carry out a fingertip search of the area. What they found we later discovered were a couple of bits and pieces, including a tiny spring and another element from a multifunction penknife. What police didn't find was any trace of a car overtaking another car on the soft December winter verges of this pretty narrow road.
Police had also found a black beanie hat in the hedgerow next to where Lee's car had been parked.
So our assumption was, well, this has maybe fallen out of the assailant's pocket and he's not realised it. So, of course, that went to the laboratory fairly quickly with a view towards DNA and from hair samples, that sort of thing. And we had the report back by the Wednesday that this was animal hair and it was cat hair, black and white cat hair. Well, there's a black and white cat at Tracey's. And so we went down and took a sample of hair from the cat, and it was the cat hair. And then, as I understand it later on, it was accepted that this was Lee's hat, but had been in Tracey's pocket prior to the offence taking place.
Andrews' lie about the hat was just one of many inconsistencies in her story.
In Lee's hand, they found between 80 and 100 strands of Tracey's hair that have been pulled from Tracey's head as Lee has tried to defend himself. Now, if Lee had been murdered by this fat man with staring eyes, why would he have Tracey's hair in his hand?
Well, the pathologist's evidence was that this was more than just a death grasp stroking, that it was a reasonable clump, that it had a good pull. But of course, Tracey's view was, well, this must have been when he was going and he got his hand on my hair, you know. So it came as a sort of, as Lee was passing away, he'd pulled some hair from her head.
Her story really was starting to crumble at that point in time, and combined with her suicide attempt, I think the police decided that's enough evidence. We can now move in and arrest her.
On Saturday, December the 7th, 1996, 6 days after Lee's murder, Tracie Andrews was arrested in hospital and taken into custody.
The 27-year-old woman was arrested at 11 o'clock today, but so far detectives have released no further details. Until this development, the police had been looking for two men who they believe may have escaped from the scene in a dark Ford Sierra.
The evidence from the two witnesses who'd seen Lee Harvey's vehicle through the junction that night was extremely impactful. And realistically, without a following vehicle, without a dark-coloured Ford Sierra chasing that car, then the whole being of that explanation from Tracey just didn't stand up.
Further evidence pointed towards Andrews being the killer after the clothes she was wearing on the night of the murder were forensically tested.
The forensic scientist who had examined one of Tracey's zip-up boots, she had a pair of ankle boots on, and within that he'd found a mark in the leather which had a rounded top on it and seemed to bear all the impression of the outside shape of the knife. And that's the hypothesis, that she carried the knife away from the scene in her boot, and that as soon as she got to the hospital she was able to dispose of it.
She could have easily just like thrown the knife into the grass or into the forest, whatever it was, and hope the police wouldn't find. But she even thought, no, these guys are gonna bring dogs. They're gonna, search the whole area. They will probably find something.
Tracie Andrews was officially charged with the murder of Lee Harvey on December the 19th, 1996. Raoul Moat was born on the 17th of June in Gateshead in the northeast of England.
He was raised largely by his grandmother. His mother had some mental health issues, but she lived in the local area, so he did have some contact with her. But it wasn't anything really out of the ordinary. A lot of families have to cope with that kind of thing.
During the 1970s and 80s, the northeast of England was an area in economic decline. Its traditional heavy industries such as shipbuilding and mining were phased out, and many men lost their jobs.
It wasn't a particularly economically prosperous area, so it was always going to be a challenge for Moat to find his way in the world as a man. Many teenagers go through a lot of changes, particularly at momentous points in their teenage years. When Moat was 16, he left school, and there were some changes in him around about that time. So he became quite fixated on bodybuilding. And this is something that you often find with young working class lads in an area where the prospects of those traditional kind of tough men's jobs are few and far between. They look to other ways to become men, to make themselves visibly masculine. And I think that was what Moat was doing.
When you see the results, then in anything, you get more, oh wow, this is working. So then he went more and more, and then he started getting into steroids.
It was clear that Moat had some serious psychiatric problems growing up, and he'd obviously decided to express himself as the big fella around town. He was 6'3", 17 stone, and liked this idea of being a large, well-built, muscle bodybuilder, and he clearly used a lot of steroids. And people who were close to him talked time and time again about just what a terrible temper he'd got.
Moat was somebody who has what I would describe as poor behavioural control. So somebody who flies off the handle quite easily, somebody who's quite readily aggravated. And if you throw steroids into the mix, you get what people often refer to as roid rage, you know, a real inability to control your temper. And it increases the levels of testosterone in the body. So when somebody has a predilection towards aggression, and then you add that on top of it, you've got a really toxic mix.
Moat had found work as a tree surgeon, and his physical appearance came in handy in his other role as a nightclub doorman. By 2005, the 32-year-old was caught by the police carrying a knuckle duster and a samurai sword. He'd fallen foul of the law on numerous occasions.
He was known to the police for incidents of domestic abuse. He had a number of partners with which he had troubled relationships with, and the police were involved. He had arrests for, generally speaking, low-level violence.
By 2010, 37-year-old Moat had fathered several children with different partners. His latest girlfriend, Samantha, was 15 years his junior. They'd been in an on and off relationship for 6 years and had a daughter together.
Well, the relationship between Samantha and Moat was an incredibly controlling one. It's one that I classify as coercively controlling. So Moat believed that Samantha was his possession. He was in control, he decided what happened, and she basically had to suck it up and get on with it. So it was his rules. Everything was focused around him.
And he would control everything. He would control her movements, what she could buy, could not buy, what she did, who she talked to on the phone. So obviously Samantha would probably feel like completely controlled. She didn't have the right to do anything.
You often find in relationships like this, women are kind of treading on eggshells, trying not to upset their abusive partner. But at the same time, it's very, very difficult for them to leave. Often looking from the outside, we say, well, why are you staying in this relationship? And often it's to keep themselves safe, because they know that if they were to leave, they'd put themselves in quite a significant amount of danger.
Samantha was desperate to leave Raoul Moat, and in the spring of 2010, a chance presented itself. Moat was convicted of assaulting a family member and sentenced to 18 weeks in Durham prison. Moat's anger was uncontrollable. He decided he was going to kill Christopher Brown as soon as he got out of jail. He enlisted the help of a friend, Carl Ness.
Moat started planning this while he was in prison. He recruited, or he used Carl Ness to keep an eye on Samantha and do what we would call surveillance by watching her house, seeing who comes and goes, identifying vehicles, and try and identify who the new boyfriend was.
On Thursday, the 1st of July 2010, 37-year-old Raoul Moat was released from prison. He didn't waste any time. It's alleged that Carl Ness had found a shotgun for him to use.
The way in which Moat planned this was quite meticulous. He took steps to try and identify the karate instructor, i.e. Christopher, by making phone calls to health centres, to karate clubs, to the extent that he actually drove around the routes that they took on the fatal night. They actually had a dry run, if you like, on the Thursday night.
On Friday the 2nd of July, staff at Durham Prison warned Northumbria police that Moat might pose a risk to Samantha. But unfortunately, the information wasn't acted upon. The same day, Moat was captured on CCTV in Newcastle, sporting a Mohican hairstyle. Later that night, Carl Ness drove Moat to nearby Gateshead, where Samantha and Christopher were at a house party.
Moat was dropped off quite near the address that Samantha and Christopher were visiting, and he was able to walk in there and hide himself underneath the front window next to the front door, where he was able to listen because it was a July night, the window was open, it was warm.
He could hear people talking and saying things, and he picked up on things that were being said about him or things that he perceived to be about him. And he started texting his friend Ness and expressing his anger and frustration at what he was hearing. This is going on, it's really annoying me. He's essentially venting. And this is something that you see narcissistic people do quite a lot. They want an audience for their complaints and their rants. They want validation. They want other people to agree with them and say, yeah, you're completely reasonable.
Moat lay in wait outside the house.
Around about 2:30 in the morning, Samantha and Christopher leave, and as they come out the front door, Moat stood up. He was clearly armed with a gun, and pretty much without warning, he immediately shot Christopher. Christopher started trying to run away, and as he tried to run across the grass area, he was shot again, which was enough to make him fall. Moat then calmly walked over, reloaded his gun in front of witnesses, and then shot him a third time, causing his death. It was nothing more than a cold and calculated assassination.
It was a public execution. Moat had used a sawn-off shotgun to shoot Christopher Brown at point-blank range. On the evening of Friday, the 9th of July, the nation was glued to their television sets as the drama unfolded. But this wasn't a film, it was real life. The police were dealing with a man who was erratic, armed, and extremely dangerous.
We had police negotiators who were there on the scene, face to face, who spent the next 6 hours or so speaking to him and trying to persuade him that the right thing to do was put the gun down and surrender himself to custody.
The police were determined to make sure that Moat came out of the standoff alive. The presence of the media added extra pressure on their performance.
You're there focused on doing your job, but you're doing your job in the knowledge that there's lots of people watching you, scrutinising you, and some of them judging you.
But Moat wasn't planning on giving himself up so easily, and the case continued to attract media attention.
The extraordinary part of this story was the involvement of celebrities. Almost as the manhunt came to its dramatic and fatal climax, we got the almost bizarre scene of Gaza, Paul Gascoigne, famous England footballer, turning up in his dressing gown, claiming to know Raoul Moat and offering Moat chicken and lager if he gave himself up. Didn't come to anything. The police just asked Gaza to politely leave the town and had nothing more to do with it.
As the night of Friday, the 9th of July, turned into the early hours of Saturday, the situation remained tense. Negotiations with Moat weren't working, and he remained where he was, with a gun pointed at his own head.
It was an incredibly long and tense night. Darkness fell. We really could see very little of what was going on. We could just see the outlines of the police cordon, and the night dragged on after midnight. into the small hours, and it was around 1 o'clock in the morning when there was a dramatic series of events, hard to make out. It was confused, it was dark, it was very difficult to know exactly what the sequence of events were.
In one last attempt to capture Moat, the police decided to use a taser on the 37-year-old. They were determined to take him alive.
On this occasion, the tasers that were used were long tasers, like shotgun-style tasers, which hadn't yet been approved for use by the police. When you're in a mindset and a determination to arrest somebody, to call them to account for the crimes that they've committed in the safest possible way, then it was right and proper that it was given a try. It didn't work.
At approximately 1:15 a.m. on Sunday the 10th of July, the sound of a shotgun blast, followed by shouting, signalled that Raoul Moat had taken his own life.